Morning everyone, I'm Gill. I'm best known for having a very loud voice, and I've already deafened your poor sound guy at the back, so if I see anybody with their hands over their ears, I will take the hint. When JISC don't use me for shouting and crowd control, I've been doing a lot of work over the last few years with them on supporting a range of activities relating to assessment and feedback practice. And I was asked to come here today and to give you a short tour of the landscape that we mapped out, showing how people right across the UK are using technology to support their practice. Now, if you were wondering what to bring along for the trip today, then as you can see from the picture, it's a bit of a varied landscape. You can expect sun and a bit of snow. There are some lush green pastures, but there are a few mountains to be climbed as well. Before setting off, I'd just like to give you a little bit of background to how we started off on this journey. JISC ran an assessment and feedback programme between 2011 and 2014, which involved more than 30 institutions right across the UK and directly involved 2,200 staff and over 6,000 students across all of the main academic disciplines. And most of what I'll be talking about today comes from that programme that's recently finished and a new programme of work that's still ongoing. The institutions that took part were looking to effect measurable change in their assessment and feedback practice. So one of the things that we asked them to do right at the start was to establish some kind of baseline against which that programme could be measured. And that baseline included a detailed analysis of practice in their own institutions and literature reviews and other research that actually gave us this wider picture of the whole landscape. We published the baseline review in 2012, and overall it gave a rather bleak picture of the landscape as a whole. We saw that there were excellent examples of good practice right across the UK, but they seemed to exist in isolated pockets within the overall setting of a culture that was very, very set in traditional ways and stubbornly resistant to change. We found that the real responsibility for assessment and feedback practice is generally highly devolved within institutions, and not surprisingly what this results in is considerable variations in practice that at a senior management level we're actually starting to give real cause for concern about issues such as parity and equity of the student learning experience across the different parts of the institution. We found that formal policy and procedure documentation was actually quite technical, quite procedural in nature, and it was slow to catch up with the shift in thinking about assessment as a much more developmental process in which students should be active participants. We found that the opportunities for students to engage with assessment design, to engage with the process of making academic judgments was actually quite limited, and engagement with employers was causing some institutions to question whether some of their practices really well reflected the way that professionals develop formatively in their careers. And we also found that the academic structure of degrees, particularly modularisation, was increasingly problematic. It was segregating learning and hence assessment into discrete chunks that didn't always build back up into the desired set of programme outcomes. I see from one or two nods that I may be seeing things that are quite familiar to you so far. As regards the technology, we found that the investment people had made in infrastructure wasn't really delivering the anticipated efficiencies as yet. They're quite slow to be realised, not least because of these levels of devolution that I mentioned earlier, which meant that the technologies are having to support different parts of the institution doing things in very different ways. And indeed, whether or not to make use of the technology at all was often a matter of discretion for individual academics. So although we saw excellent examples of practice, they were often difficult to scale up between groups of early adopters or to scale to increasingly large class sizes. Now, for anybody that was setting out on this journey today, I'd recommend 2 travel essentials for you. These are things that you've got to keep with you in your hand luggage. You never want to be parted from these. Now, the first we had from the start, but we didn't actually realise its importance. The second, this was our compass. The second, I'll talk about that first, is what I've described as our map and phrasebook. And it's an assessment and feedback life cycle that was originally developed by Manchester Metropolitan University. It had been picked up and used and adapted by a number of different institutions before we really latched onto it as being important to the JISC work. If you have a look at our blog, you'll see an interesting adaptation from the University of Edinburgh, where they have done different views of this for different stakeholders. What the life cycle is fundamentally an academic model that shows a high-level view of academic processes and decision points, and provides a ready means of mapping admin processes and supporting technologies against this. The people who developed it, they describe it as being pedagogically neutral, by which they mean it's more just an aid to asking the right questions, thinking about things at the right times, rather than having a basis in any particular pedagogic stance. You can apply it to either formative or summative assessment, and it works on different scales of learning, whether you're actually looking at a 3-year degree that might go many times around this life cycle, or a short piece of learning that could take place over a day. What's equally useful about it is that it applies to all assessment and feedback practice, whether or not your materials are actually originating in digital form or supported by information systems. And we found that using this model serves as a framework to get a holistic picture of activity right across an institution, and a means of encouraging dialogue between all of the different stakeholders that tend to work in silos and see this life cycle from their own particular perspective. Interestingly, from all the people we've spoken to in the course of this research, it seems to work as well for FE at this high level as it does for HE as well. At this point, I'd like to do a quick straw poll. I'm hoping, can everyone see the headings on the life cycle? You can read it? No, right. Well, I'll run through them, and I'd just like you to I'll take a show of hands as a gut feeling about which of these areas you think they're the most problematic and we've got the most work left to do in terms of supporting the processes via technology. And we're looking at specifying curriculum design. Number 2 is setting actual instances of curriculum delivery for a particular delivery instance, the timing and scheduling. Number 3 is supporting students. Number 4 is submission. 5, marking and production of feedback. 6, recording grades. 7, returning marks and feedback. And 8, supporting staff and student reflection on it to go around the loop again. So if you could maybe just raise your hands only once. It's very just quick gut feeling. Who thinks that the main problems are in specifying and curriculum design? Well, setting particular delivery instances, managing, supporting students. You don't have many problems around here, do you? Submission. Marking and production of feedback, recording grades, returning marks and feedback, and supporting reflection. All right, there's some kind of clear patterns emerging there. Interesting. You might think this is a bit of a ramble, and it's taken me quite a long time to get to the starting point of this. Well, you're absolutely right, and that's because I set off without the first of those travel essentials, which is the compass that says whether or not I'm heading in the right direction. And in this case, the compass is a set of educational principles that underpin teaching, learning and assessment in any particular institution. If the image that I've selected for this slide maybe seems a little bit obscure, what it's trying to represent is the way in which some of our projects found themselves wandering through a complex maze of practice when they undertook these baseline reviews, and finding that they actually needed to go back to the start and find their own compass. If anybody was geared up for a long-haul trip, then you might be surprised to find that the tour starts not so very far away in Glasgow. And the work of Professor David Nicol and universities at the colleagues at the University of Strathclyde has underpinned a lot of recent developments in this area. Hoping that most of you will have heard of the REAP project, Re-Engineering Assessment Practice. Yep, quite a lot of nods. And that was an important piece of work that defined a set of assessment principles that many others have used and built on. There are other sets that are commonly referenced as well, the University of Hertfordshire's Assessment for Learning Principles, a set that were produced by the NUS as well. I'm not going to talk about any of the principles in detail, but if anybody isn't familiar with this work and really hasn't heard about it, then frankly, I think my best advice is stop listening to me and just Google it now, because it's really important stuff. And really, it was key to the work that we did. And for many institutions, the process of identifying, debating what's fundamentally important about their assessment practice was every bit as important as the actual outcomes. Maybe a couple of other things that you might want to think about when starting out as well is what kind of approach is actually going to be most effective in your institution. And in a lot of cases, we found it was some kind of appreciative inquiry type approaches. It's a technique that I've referenced at the end. You can find out more about it, but it's basically about taking as your starting point what you do well and what you've actually got to build on, rather than hitting people with what's wrong here and what do we need to do to fix it. And finally, assuming that I'm given a reasonable hand baggage allowance, then there's one thing I think, another thing that I would always take, and that's the University of Ulster Viewpoints cards. This is a very simple approach to getting you to think about putting principles into practice. And I know that you've got an exercise today using those cards, so I'll not say any more about them at the moment. So really defining the educational values that characterise a university was what enabled a mix of academics, learning technologists, QA people and administrators to work together to look at whether their principles were really reflected in their current practice and where they needed to improve to move forward on a shared understanding about what was really important to them. And that combination of the underpinning principles and the life cycle as a framework for dialogue really got us moving in the right direction. It might sound blindingly obvious to say, starting an important project like this, start from what you agree on as principles, but a lot of projects that involve different parts of the university tend not to do this. They're looking at it from very different perspectives. And it's actually less easy than you might think to get it right as well, because you need to come up with principles that get widespread support, but it's got to go beyond motherhood and apple pie to something that challenges your current thinking and to something that actually demands action as well, rather than just a nodding acceptance. The example I've put up here is a diagram that Queen's at Belfast produced to show how each of its assessment and feedback principles supported an overarching aim that was encourage positive motivational beliefs and self-esteem. And they took very much an appreciative inquiry approach to transforming their practice. The reason the diagram is colour-coded is that they've produced a set of guidance resources showing examples of how you can actually implement each one of those particular principles, and in the links I've given you, you've got access to them. And there are a set of cards, technology cards as well, that show what technologies can underpin particular principles. And it was the approach that quite a number of institutions took. Once they had these principles in place, they could suddenly start to look at what can technology do to support it. It's not the other way around. You've got to know what you're trying to do in the first place. University of Exeter took the Top Trumps card game. They produced technology trumps, and there's a set of cards that you can get online that show what technologies support particular principles. I think Bath Spa did something similar as well. Actually implementing the principles is, of course, an interesting voyage of discovery, because you can take a principle such as help clarify good performance. Yes, it's sound, but you can actually implement it in a number of different ways, from being quite teacher-led to ways that are much more learning-centric. In that example, just providing students with a rubric showing marking criteria and grades is an improvement that might help clarity, transparency. But then again, actually asking the students themselves to come up with a set of criteria against which they think a piece of work could be judged might go further in actually helping them develop their own capability to understand the process of making academic choices. So in the links that I'll give you, lots more examples of how people actually put those principles into practice. And a major focus of much of this work was supporting improving the extent to which feedback supports the ongoing development of learners, feeding forward into their future learning. And we saw real shifts away from summative towards much more formative assessment, away from assessment of learning to much more assessment for learning. A lot of the projects were focusing on things like ipsative approaches, whereby feedback acknowledges a learner's progress against their previous performance rather than some kind of external benchmark. Now, although this is primarily a learning design issue, technology also has a vital role to play here in terms of storing feedback across a programme and actually making it accessible to staff and students in order that they can develop this long-term picture. But we found that most of the systems being used actually store marks and feedback at a modular level, and it's not always easy to gain a programme level overview. And one of the ideas for how we might address this problem is something that I'll come back to. I said how you actually design the curriculum in the first place is fundamental to permit longitudinal development. And common problems that we found were a lack of formative opportunities or a lack of time for feedback to actually inform the next assignment and have an impact. This diagram shows the use of a very useful tool that was produced by the University of Hertfordshire called Assessment Timelines, and it's been picked up and used by many others. I've put an example up there from Dundee, as we're in Scotland, but just a simple way of actually mapping out your assessment on a semester or across a year and taking a good look at it to see where it actually can be improved. There's a link to where you can download the tool again at the end of the slides. So in making better use of feedback, then the issues to be addressed are partly cultural, the fact that there's actually not a lot of dialogue between academics about feedback, and structural in terms of how you've actually designed the curriculum and what systems you've got to allow you to access that feedback. And it is a particular problem, not least for people like part-time tutors who maybe only teach a small part of a course, and it's often difficult for them to get an understanding of how their bit feeds into the curriculum as a whole, and to to see whether the feedback they're given just simply, it's learners are making repeat mistakes time and time again and failing to act on that feedback because nobody's actually getting that longitudinal view. So a lot of the projects address this. You should maybe look at the work from the Institute of Education, which was trying to get students to build up an assessment career, taking ipsative approaches. University of Dundee had a lot of focus on this area, longitudinal view of tutor feedback and encouraging student reflection on that. And I think you've got Dundee as one of your case studies today. And maybe you might like to look at the work of Bath Spa and Winchester as well, who again looked at whole programme transformation and had some very interesting examples of the use of student fellows to support this and to particularly support how technology was introduced into that process. So what we're really asking people to do in terms of doing something differently with feedback is change behaviours that are actually quite ingrained, quite habitual. And we also found that projects had to deal with a fear that giving better feedback necessarily is going to mean increased workload for academics. One of the lovely pieces of evidence, again from University of Dundee, I don't know whether you're going to talk about that today, I don't want to spoil anything you're going to say later, but they got some really good evidence that improving feedback actually improved the self-dependency of learners and reduced the overall amount of time that they spent giving feedback and reduced the need to keep repeating the same feedback over and over again. It was the Effect project. I think that's not the project you're talking about today, is it? It's Interact, so right. Okay, I haven't stolen your thunder, but people should go and look up that work as well.
It's the Interact project. Talking on that.
Yeah, it's the Effect project did some work on that area as well. Yeah. But back to these cultural issues, I think that really one of the most astonishing things was this almost total lack of discussion that seemed to take place about approaches to feedback. The Institute of Education talked about the feedback happening in a black box, and that experience was borne out by very, very many other institutions, that the focus of their quality assurance activities was on comparing and moderating marks, and there was little, if any, discussion at all within programme teams about individual approaches to feedback and the types of feedback they were giving. So it's completely unsurprising that students report inconsistencies in the types of feedback that they receive. And one of the really valuable pieces of the evidence base from this work was a range of audits in different institutions of tutor feedback. Number of places did this. They produced tools for profiling and analysing feedback that, again, you can access online. Queen's did something like that. The example I've put up there is from the Institute of Education. And what was most interesting about this was that different institutions did it, they used different tools and approaches, and what they all found was that their feedback was skewed rather than the kind of balance that they would have expected. Now, exactly how it was skewed towards different elements varied according to the institution, according to the subject area that they were looking at. In general, a lot of it was content focused rather than competency focused, and a lot of it was very, very immediate and short term rather than truly developmental. But rather than get into the specifics of what any of these audits revealed, what was just most useful about it was the eye-opening. People were just surprised because they hadn't talked about feedback before and they didn't know that these differences existed. And it really started a dialogue about what purpose feedback was actually intended to serve and whether they were achieving this. You might think I've got quite a long way in without having said very much about technology. I think you were maybe prepared for that in the introduction. I keep saying, yeah, we saw excellent examples, but the most important messages were around learning and teaching practice, the going back to basics, looking at why we're doing things and what we want to achieve rather than the how we use technology to do this came later, it was in the background. We did, however, right from the start, get some very clear messages that electronic management of assessment is both effective and efficient, that it provided the best support for a very significant proportion of learners. One of the early pieces of research in this was an extensive report by the University of Huddersfield, and I would certainly recommend that to anybody interested in the topic and things like staff attitudes in particular to the issues. And the evidence base and the interest in this work was such that JISC undertook a further programme of work in this area. We produced a baseline review not long ago, August 2014, on electronic management of assessment, and you can download this. And we worked with a very significant number of institutions in different ways to again study the landscape. We saw many of the same broad trends that the heads of e-learning forum had shown up in their surveys over a number of years, but we didn't just want to update what they'd already done. We wanted to dig a little further into some of the issues. So although we did an online questionnaire, it allowed for a lot of very open-ended responses. We had a think tank with about 35 institutions, again, discussing the issues. And just giving people a very open opportunity to talk. We found that although the trends were common, that there are actually quite a lot of nuances. And when you asked what does this look like, what does it feel like, people often said, well, it depends which bit of the institution you're talking about. It depends which bit of which system you're talking about. It depends which type of assessment you're talking about. And it all really backed up this picture that because things are so devolved, the initiatives are really quite localised. And a lot of institutions are still in pretty early stages of actually trying to look at this and scale it up to institution-wide approaches. And if we're to break the broad term EMA down into component parts, then it appears that e-submission is far and away the most embedded and widespread practice. Very, very significant number of institutions say, yeah, a number of our faculties and departments are doing this. We had 32% said that, yeah, e-submission is now mandatory across the institution. E-feedback seemed to be the next most widespread practice, and a lot of that, people said, was in response to student demand for it. There are about 20% said, yeah, we have this mandated across the institution, and again, more said that, yeah, it's mandatory in parts of the institution. And perhaps less surprisingly, e-marking is lagging behind, although gaining ground. We found that there's maybe only about 10% of people said that, yeah, actually we've got e-marking as compulsory across the institution. This final one, e-exams, seems to be the least mature area, really. We had over a quarter of people said that they weren't doing anything at all in this area as yet, although a lot of people thought it was coming over the horizon and it could become quite important quite quickly to them. Perhaps this is one of the key differences between HE and FE, because in FE there's a lot of focus on online testing and online exams, because it is an awarding body requirement in many cases. So I should perhaps have said at the start that what I'm talking about today really has very much an HE slant on it for this audience. So we asked people what were the pain points with EMA. They didn't hold back from telling us. They opened up a world of pain. What it's showing is their responses about what the key pain points were, and they're sorted in descending order of the most problematic. So this green here is very problematic. And if we run through the things that are coming up at the top, then systems integration generally, integrating the VLE and student record system, inflexibility of systems, and then there's a chunk about supporting particular business processes within information systems. The other biggie up here, it's the second bar down there, is staff resistance. And there was only about 4% of people that didn't think this was a problem. Interestingly, student resistance comes right at the bottom there. In terms of staff resistance, interestingly, even the people who said it wasn't much of a problem at the minute said that actually they thought as EMA became more widespread and as aspects of it became mandatory, they might expect that staff attitudes would actually harden and that resistance would increase over time rather than decrease. So why is this stuff so painful? It's obvious that a lot of the systems that we're using, particularly those that have their origins in the United States, don't support some of the common UK marking and feedback workflows particularly well. I have to say that with the caveat that there have been new releases of a couple of major products since we actually did this research. And it's equally clear that there are some diverging views about what constitutes good academic practice when it comes to some of these processes. So some of it perhaps might just be our own fault as well. If we look at the systems in use, now there are an awful lot of technologies that are being used to support different aspects of assessment and feedback practice. But if you get to the real heart of this life cycle and the core of EMA, then there are actually quite a limited range of systems. It's usually this trilogy of your student record system, your VLE, and some piece of specialist assessment management software. And in terms of what's in current use, then SIT's Blackboard Turnitin and SIT's Moodle Turnitin accounts for well over half of the HE sector. And a lot of the rest of the variation is just the different student record systems in use. So given that there aren't really that many of them, you might expect that they would be better integrated than they actually seem to be at the minute, and that they might work better together. We did some stats. We asked people about how integrated their systems were. There was over half of them indicated that they were pretty loosely integrated. There's a lot of manual intervention to get these things to work together. More people, 11%, said they had completely separate systems than said they had highly integrated systems. We had about 7% that thought their systems were highly integrated. 3 of these were universities, and all the rest were HE and FE providers. They weren't actually universities. So it's maybe not quite as surprising as it seems on the face of it, because some of these core tools, we've actually been using them for quite a while. We maybe bought them for different, quite discrete purposes, and it's only now that we're trying to join them together and actually use them to support much more of an end-to-end workflow approach. And of course, it is those business processes and the workflows that are the other side of the same coin, because it's hard to integrate systems and design effective workflows when the business processes are very varied. I hinted at that earlier. We asked about variation. 85% of you told us that your business processes are pretty varied across the institution. 12% said they were highly standardised, and when you looked at who they were generally pretty small, pretty specialised, or people that we knew had been through a major process review fairly recently. And again, even of the few who thought, oh, we're getting there with standardisation, the devil was in the detail. Many of them didn't realise how varied the processes were until they tried to implement EMA. Many thought, yeah, ostensibly on the face of it, we've got quite standard policies and procedures, but there's a lot of local variation in how those policies are implemented. For instance, you might have a policy on late submission, but local interpretation of what constitutes a late submission can vary significantly. We have issues with systems, we have issues with business processes, and we have differences in academic practice. And perhaps one of the examples that illustrates the interplay of all these factors is the question of anonymous marking, because it's something that's quite difficult to achieve when you're using a combination of systems, because anonymity in one system can be lost or compromised when data is transferred elsewhere. It's something that requires clarity of definition and process about what constitutes anonymity and what meets the requirement for achieving it. And the debate about its value anyway highlights differences in academic opinion. That there are some institutions that feel strongly that they don't think anonymous marking is beneficial because it inhibits a contextual view of the learners. It inhibits ipsative feedback. Others would say, well, it's pointless because good teachers know their students. They can always tell whose work they're marking. And others would say, it's one of our cornerstones of quality assurance. You need this to combat unconscious bias in marking. And wherever institutions sit on this spectrum, they generally say it's demand from their particular student body that drives the way they do things as well. I couldn't resist putting this slide in because when we look at how many people are dissatisfied with the way they do things at the minute, and you ask, well, why can't you do something differently, then a very common response is that QA is a barrier. And whether they think it's their internal QA processes or external QA processes, there are a lot of urban myths about what regulations there actually are and what you can and can't do. And it's not new to us. Way back in 2009, we did a baseline review of curriculum design practice. We found that the innovation was cropping up in the cracks between the formal parts of the process. People were trying to stay under the radar because they had this idea that regulations were much more onerous and restrictive than they actually were. So having unearthed this host of issues around EMA, what we then did some work with the community around was actually looking at what were the real priorities to address, the things that had the most impact on the widest range of stakeholders. And again, you're going to have to look at the slides later or the report to read them, but we mapped this against the life cycle, and yeah, a lot of hands up for number 5. You can start to see 5 and 8 showing up there. Although you can't read them, it becomes very much clearer when we look at the top 20 challenges that people identified, that there is a big chunk of this problem zone that's related to marking and feedback processes. And the other areas where things seem to group around what I might call student assessment literacies generally, student engagement with the process, students' ability to make use of feedback. So having identified all the problems, asked people to prioritise them, we then started to look at what solutions might exist. And in December, we brought a number of institutions together to look at solutions. I think one of the people in that picture is here today, actually. And what they came up with was a list of 30 possible solutions that they thought they would like the community to act on and work on. And we kind of thought we'd go through another round of prioritising and categorising them to decide what JISC should take forward. And then when we looked at these 30, it just worked out so neatly that they actually addressed 5 main themes that were also the 5 top challenges. They weren't all over the place. So it was really encouraging that people agreed what the top problems were, and when they were just given a free rein to think about solutions, they actually thought these problems were things that we could actually tackle as well. The fact that there were so many flavours of tackling each topic showed that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, but it just gives us reasonable confidence that there is something we can do about some of this stuff. So in terms of next steps, JISC took all that and agreed 4 projects out of all that it wanted to take forward, or the community wanted JISC to take forward. The first one, it's provisionally titled EMA Requirements Map. It's actually looking at all of this diversity of practice and different processes and workflows, and that it's grounded on some solid research that says, actually, when it comes to important academic decisions, there aren't that many flavours. There may be about 5 or 6 core processes with some interesting kind of variables and variants on each. But we can actually describe this in a way that we can start to have sensible discussions with system suppliers about what are common problems and finding some more elegant and long-term solutions to things that are currently requiring workarounds for a lot of solutions. The EMA toolkit, there was a lot of demand for actually bundling this good practice and guidance together in an accessible way. On the basis of a very early conversation, I'm pleased to say that it seems that QAA might actually be interested in being a partner in this, in giving us a perspective from your community about what's actually needed, about what might be the best ways to present that. This difficulty in getting a programme level of feedback. At the minute, JISC is just doing a feasibility study about whether they could create some kind of feedback hub. I don't know at the minute whether it would be literally some platform-independent tool that JISC creates, or whether they might work with a range of suppliers and different flavours on that. And something around systems integration that will probably be part of this toolkit, looking at this triumvirate of systems and the major integration points between them. I said there were 5 solution ideas. The 5th one was around reliability of submissions, and that's going to be rolled into the toolkit as well. Pretty packed itinerary for the time we've got, and getting kind of close to running out of time. So all I've really been able to do is just highlight things and point things that you might want to revisit at leisure. So what I've done on this slide is just try to theme them a bit and suggest that institutions' work that you might want to look at if you're interested in any of these topics. And on any good tour, it's always nice to have some memorabilia to take home, isn't it? In this case, the souvenirs are of much better quality than the picture might suggest. All of the projects have produced a wealth of resources. They will be nicely packaged and gift wrapped for you to take home in the toolkit. But that should be out this summer. But in the meantime, you can dig around in the reports and on the design studio and find them all. Particular things to look out for: the viewpoints cards, the assessment timelines tool, University of Hertfordshire assessment resource calculator, the feedback audit tools to help you match technologies to principle, rubrics and grading criteria, and something that was launched a fortnight ago, an open source Moodle plugin that allows you to report on feedback or all programme feedback in a single place. So there's already a lot of good practice out there. It's being shared, but we are nowhere near the end of this work yet, and there are lots of opportunities for you still to get involved, particularly with workflows and the toolkit. So please get in touch if you're interested. And finally, we will be down your way again very shortly. In June, the University of Abertay is hosting a major European conference. And as part of the pre-conference activities, JISC is working with UNIS, the European partner, to organise a one-day workshop on EMA and assessment analytics. So you can find out about similar work in Europe, get involved with ongoing projects. Managed to get some sponsorship to make some free places available for Scottish institutions. The booking form's just opened. I've got a few flyers here. So if you're interested and you want details, then I'm around all day. So please come and ask about that.